The autumn evening wrapped the suburban neighborhood in a gentle blanket of golden light. Inside a well-kept two-story house on Oak Street, a 12-year-old boy sat at the kitchen table, his math homework spread out before him. His pencil tapped rhythmically against the wooden surface as he worked through another algebra problem. The smell of his mom's famous lasagna filled the air, making his stomach rumble with anticipation. "Hey, sweetie," his mom called from where she stood stirring a pot of sauce on the stove. "Could you take out the trash before dinner?" She wiped her hands on her apron, the same one she'd worn every Sunday for the past 5 years while teaching him how to cook. Her kind eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled at her son. "Sure, Mom," he replied, already pushing back his chair. He was a good kid, the type who never complained about chores and always tried his best to help around the house, especially since his dad had started working longer hours at the hospital. His teachers often praised his polite manners and eagerness to learn. Just last week, he'd gotten an A+ on his science project about renewable energy. The kitchen clock read 6:45 p.m. as he grabbed the trash bag from under the sink. The sun was setting earlier these days, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and purple. He could hear the neighbor's dog barking in the distance and kids playing basketball a few houses down. It was just another normal evening in their peaceful neighborhood, where most families had lived for years, and everyone generally looked out for each other. As he dragged the heavy bin down the driveway, he thought about the upcoming basketball tryouts. He'd been practicing every day after school, determined to make the team this year. The trash bin wheels squeaked slightly as they rolled over the concrete. His mom had mentioned they should probably get a new one soon. A cool breeze rustled through the maple trees lining their street, sending a few early fallen leaves dancing across his path. Through the kitchen window, his mom watched him with pride. She'd raised him to be responsible and independent, teaching him the importance of contributing to the household from an early age. The porch light wasn't working, another item on their weekend to-do list, but there was still plenty of daylight left. She could see him clearly as he carefully positioned the bin at the curb, just like she taught him, making sure it wouldn't block anyone's path on the sidewalk. The boy took a moment to stretch, his school sweatshirt riding up slightly. He'd grown 3 inches over the summer, and they'd just bought him new clothes for the school year. His mom often joked that she could barely keep up with his growth spurts. From down the street came the familiar sound of Mr. Wilson walking his golden retriever. They were always right on schedule with their evening routine. Everything felt peaceful and ordinary, just as it should be in a neighborhood where children rode their bikes freely and families gathered for weekend barbecues. The boy had lived here his entire life, his room upstairs still decorated with the solar system wall decals he'd begged for in 3rd grade. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every house, and every neighbor's name. He glanced up at the darkening sky, remembering he still had to finish his math homework before watching the new episode of his favorite science show. His best friend from school had promised they'd talk about it during lunch tomorrow. These simple moments, doing chores, thinking about school, planning for tomorrow, were the building blocks of his everyday life. Little did he know that in the next few minutes, this ordinary evening would transform into something entirely different. The peaceful routine he'd known his entire life was about to be disrupted in a way that would change not just his own perspective, but that of his entire community. For now, though, he was just a 12-year-old boy taking out the trash as the autumn evening settled around him, his mind full of homework, basketball tryouts, and what his mom might pack in his lunch tomorrow. The quiet evening shattered in an instant. The boy was just about to turn back toward the house when he heard the sound of car engines growing louder, followed by the distinctive crunch of tires slowing on pavement. Before he could fully process what was happening, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb, their headlights cutting bright paths through the gathering dusk. His heart jumped into his throat as bright spotlights suddenly flooded the area where he stood. The harsh beams turned the familiar space around his family's trash bins into something alien and threatening. The basketball kids down the street fell silent, their game forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. "Don't move!" The command rang out sharp and clear, bouncing off the houses lining the street. 2 officers emerged from the first cruiser, their hands hovering near their weapons. The boy froze, his mind racing but his body absolutely still, exactly as his parents had taught him for situations like this. The trash bin handle was still warm in his grip, and he couldn't decide if he should let it go or keep holding it. More car doors opened and closed. The boy could hear radio static and muffled voices coming from the police vehicles. His legs started trembling, but he forced himself to remain motionless. The porch light's broken bulb now felt like a critical absence, leaving him standing in a pool of fading daylight and harsh artificial beams. "Put your hands where we can see them." Another command, this one from a different officer. The boy slowly raised his hands, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. He could see movement in neighboring windows now, curtains twitching, faces appearing and disappearing. Mr. Wilson and his golden retriever had stopped their evening walk, standing frozen halfway down the block. One of the officers spoke into his radio, his voice carrying in the unnaturally quiet street, "We've got the suspect contained." The word suspect echoed in the boy's mind. Suspect of what? He was just taking out the trash, something he'd done hundreds of times before. He wanted to explain this, but his voice seemed trapped somewhere deep in his chest. The neighbor's security lights clicked on automatically as evening deepened, creating weird shadows that danced across the scene. The boy could hear more movement now, the sound of his mom in the kitchen, still unaware of what was happening outside. The lasagna timer would be going off soon. This thought, so normal and out of place, almost made him laugh, but fear kept the sound locked away. "Step away from the bin," an officer instructed, moving closer with measured steps. The boy complied, his movements slow and deliberate. His school sweatshirt suddenly felt too tight around his neck, and sweat trickled down his back despite the cool evening air. He could see his reflection in the cruiser's windshield, a young boy with raised hands, looking smaller than he'd ever felt before. Through the haze of fear and confusion, he became aware of other sounds. A screen door slamming somewhere nearby, running footsteps, raised voices from neighboring houses. The community was waking up to what was happening on their quiet street, but the boy remained absolutely still, remembering everything his parents had taught him about staying safe. Time seemed to stretch like taffy. Each second felt both incredibly long and impossibly short. The boy's arms were starting to ache from being held up, but he didn't dare lower them. He could smell his mom's cooking floating out from the kitchen window, a cruel reminder of how ordinary this evening had been just moments ago. More neighbors were emerging from their houses now, phones in hand, their faces showing mixtures of concern and disbelief. The boy recognized Mrs. Chen from next door, still wearing her gardening gloves, her mouth open in shock. The kids from the basketball game had moved closer, their ball forgotten in someone's front yard. The sound of his mother's voice suddenly cut through everything else. "What's going on out here?" The kitchen door slammed, and he could hear her footsteps on the porch. His heartbreak doubled. He wanted to turn around, to see her face, to run to her for protection, but he remained frozen in place, hands raised, as he'd been taught. The simple act of taking out the trash had somehow turned into this moment that felt both surreal and terrifyingly real. In the distance, more sirens wailed, growing louder. The boy's arms trembled with fatigue, but the officer's commands still rang in his ears. "Don't move." So he stood there, caught in the crossbeams of police spotlights, as his ordinary evening transformed into something that would change everything, not just for him and his family, but for their entire community. The kitchen door slammed open with such force that the sound cut through the tense silence like a thunderclap. The boy's mother rushed onto the porch, still wearing her cooking apron, her hands covered in traces of flour from the garlic bread she'd been preparing. The smell of burning lasagna wafted out behind her. The timer had gone off, but no one was paying attention to dinner anymore. "That's my son." Her voice carried across the front yard, strong but trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "He's just taking out the trash." She started down the porch steps, her movements careful but determined. The officers turned slightly, dividing their attention between mother and son, their postures tense. "Ma'am, stay where you are," one officer called out, raising his hand in a stopping motion. But she was already halfway across the lawn, her house slippers crunching on the fallen autumn leaves. 20 years of teaching elementary school had given her a presence that commanded attention, and she drew herself up to her full height as she approached. "I'm his mother," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'm a teacher at Pine Grove Elementary. We've lived in this house for 12 years. He's just doing his chores." Each sentence was clear and precise, spoken with the same measured tone she used in her classroom. The lasagna timer was still beeping faintly through the open kitchen door, a surreal soundtrack to the scene unfolding on their front lawn. More neighbors had gathered now, forming a loose semicircle at a respectful distance. Someone was live streaming the incident on their phone. Mrs. Chen had stepped forward, still in her gardening gloves, speaking up from the edge of the lawn. "That boy takes out the trash every evening. I see him from my garden. He's a good kid." The mother's hands were shaking, but her voice remained firm. "My son is 12 years old. He's an honor roll student. Please, tell me what's going on here." She wanted to run to her child, to hold him, but she forced herself to stay calm, knowing any sudden movements could make things worse. Her son still stood frozen in the police spotlights, his arms trembling from being held up so long. One of the officers spoke into his radio, then addressed her. "We received a call about suspicious activity in the area." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The mother's expression shifted from fear to a deep, knowing pain. She'd had conversations with her son about moments like this, but she'd always hoped he wouldn't have to face them so young. "Suspicious activity." She repeated the words slowly, letting their weight sink in. "Taking out the trash is suspicious?" Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "I'm watching him from the kitchen window, like I do every evening, like every parent on this street does with their children." The growing crowd of neighbors murmured in agreement. The basketball kids had edged closer, their phones out, recording everything. The mother recognized them. They'd all been in her classroom over the years. Mr. Wilson's golden retriever whined softly, picking up on the tension in the air. "We have to follow up on all calls, ma'am," another officer explained, but there was a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice. The mother took another careful step forward, her educator's instincts kicking in. She'd mediated countless conflicts in her classroom, but this was different. This was her child. "May I approach my son?" she asked, maintaining eye contact with the closest officer. Sweat had soaked through the back of her apron despite the cool evening air. She could see her son's arms shaking from exhaustion, could read the fear in his perfectly still posture. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to rush to him, but she waited for permission, understanding the delicate balance of this moment. The officers conferred briefly, their voices low. The mother used the moment to call out to her son, "Baby, it's okay. Mama's right here. Just stay still." Her words carried clearly in the evening air, steady and reassuring despite the storm of emotions behind them. More neighbors had joined the gathering crowd. The mother recognized faces from PTA meetings, soccer games, and community barbecues. Some had their phones out, documenting everything. Others stood with their arms crossed, watching intently. The sense of community support was palpable, a silent testimony to their years in the neighborhood. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the officers began to lower their defensive postures. "Okay, ma'am, you can approach slowly," one of them said. The mother moved forward with deliberate steps, her heart pounding but her exterior calm. She had to be strong for her son, had to handle this moment in a way that would help him process it later. As she reached her boy, still standing with his hands raised, the burning smell from the forgotten lasagna drifted across the yard, a harsh reminder of how quickly their normal evening had transformed into this moment. This moment that would change them, their neighborhood, and their understanding of what it meant to be doing something as simple as taking out the trash on a quiet autumn evening. By morning, the video had spread through the community like wildfire. Multiple neighbors had recorded the incident, and their combined footage told the story from different angles: a 12-year-old boy taking out the trash, the sudden arrival of police cars, the mother's intervention. The clips showed everything from the frightened stillness of the boy to the gathering of concerned neighbors on that quiet suburban street. The first news van arrived before breakfast. The mother stood at her kitchen window, watching reporters set up their equipment where her son had been standing just hours before. The trash bin was still there, a silent witness to last night's events. She hadn't slept much, spending most of the night holding her son as he processed what had happened. "Mom, my phone keeps buzzing," her son called from the living room. His classmates had been texting nonstop since the video started circulating. The local news websites had already picked up the story, with headlines that made her stomach churn. She watched as her boy sat on the couch, still in his pajamas, looking smaller somehow in the morning light. By midday, the street had transformed. Neighbors who'd witnessed the incident firsthand were giving interviews. Mrs. Chen, still wearing her gardening gloves but now standing before news cameras, spoke with quiet anger about watching the boy grow up, about his polite greetings every morning as he walked to school. The kids from the basketball game had organized a social media campaign, sharing their own videos and demanding answers. The local high school principal called an emergency assembly. In the gymnasium, hundreds of students sat in unusual silence as teachers discussed what had happened. Many of these students had younger siblings who, like the boy, did simple chores in their front yards every day. The incident had struck a deep chord, making them question activities they'd always taken for granted. Outside the police station, a crowd began gathering around lunchtime. It started small, just a few parents from the boys' school holding handmade signs. But as the afternoon wore on, more people joined. The boy's math teacher was there, holding a sign with his latest A+ test grade. The basketball kids came with their parents, wearing their team jerseys. Even Mr. Wilson showed up with his golden retriever, both wearing matching community unity bandanas someone had made. Back at home, the boy sat at his desk, trying to focus on his homework. The words in his textbook kept blurring as his mind wandered back to the previous evening. His mom had called the school, explaining his absence, but he'd insisted on doing his assignments anyway. "I don't want to fall behind," he'd said quietly, and his mother had hugged him so tight it almost hurt. The community response continued to grow. Local business owners started putting up signs in their windows. "Our children deserve better," and "Safety for all." The owner of the neighborhood pizza place delivered free pies to the protesters at the police station. The crowd had grown so large, they now filled the entire parking lot. Social media exploded with support. The hashtag Trashing Prejudice started trending locally, then nationally. People shared their own stories, their own fears, their own experiences. The boy's story had touched a nerve, highlighting how even the most ordinary activities could turn dangerous because of prejudice and assumptions. By late afternoon, the local news had gone national. Major networks picked up the story, broadcasting the neighbor's footage across the country. The boy watched a clip of himself on TV, standing perfectly still with his hands up, and felt strange, like he was watching someone else, even though he remembered every second of that fear. The protest at the police station had grown into an impromptu community meeting. People brought chairs and tables, setting up a kind of outdoor forum. Teachers, parents, community leaders, and kids all took turns speaking. They shared stories, suggested changes, demanded accountability. The atmosphere was charged but peaceful. This wasn't just about anger, it was about change. His mom's phone kept ringing with calls from reporters and supporters. Civil rights organizations reached out, offering support and legal guidance. But what touched them most were the messages from neighbors, offers of food, assistance, or just someone to talk to. Mrs. Chen had left a fresh-baked apple pie on their porch. The basketball kids had written messages in chalk on their driveway. "We stand with you," and "You're not alone." As evening approached again, the boy stood at his window, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar colors. The news vans were still there, their satellite dishes stretching up like metal trees. Protesters still gathered at the police station. His homework lay finished on his desk. Tomorrow, he would return to school, face his classmates, try to find a new normal. But tonight, something was different. Across the neighborhood, families were standing in their front yards, holding candles. They'd organized it through social media. A show of solidarity, of community, of change. The boy watched as the lights multiplied, house by house, until the entire street glowed with tiny flames. From somewhere in the crowd, someone started singing "Lean on Me," and others joined in, their voices rising in the gathering darkness. The police department's internal affairs office looked nothing like what you'd see on TV shows. It was just a simple room with fluorescent lighting and bare walls, where 3 serious-faced investigators sat reviewing body camera footage for the 5th time. They watched the scene unfold again. The boy with the trash bin, the sudden arrival of police cars, the mother's intervention. Each viewing revealed new details that made them shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Meanwhile, at school, things had changed. The boy sat in his usual seat by the window in math class, but everything felt different. His teachers watched him more closely now, their faces filled with concern when they thought he wasn't looking. During lunch break, he noticed how conversations would stop when he walked by, then restart in whispers. He wasn't just a student anymore, he had become a symbol, and that felt strange and heavy on his young shoulders. The school counselor's office had become a familiar place. "How are you feeling today?" she would ask, her voice gentle and patient. Some days he would talk about his fears, about how he jumped every time a car slowed down near their house. Other days he just sat quietly, drawing pictures or working on homework. The counselor noticed how his drawings had changed. They were darker now, with lots of blue and red lights in the backgrounds. At the police station, change was happening too. The chief sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers, policy documents, training manuals, community complaints. The viral videos played on a loop on the news channel behind him. He'd watched them countless times, each viewing making it clearer that something needed to change. His own daughter was 12, the same age as the boy. That thought kept him up at night. The boy's mother noticed small changes in their daily routine. Her son no longer went outside alone after sunset. Taking out the trash had become a family activity. They did it together now, always before dark. She saw how he would scan the street constantly, how his shoulders would tense at the sound of approaching cars. As a teacher, she recognized the signs of trauma, but as a mother, it broke her heart. Community meetings became a regular thing at the local community center. Police officers sat alongside residents, listening to stories and concerns. Some meetings got heated, voices raised in frustration and pain. Others were quieter, focused on solutions and understanding. The boy's incident had opened a door that couldn't be closed again. People were talking about things they'd been afraid to discuss before. One officer, a rookie who'd been on scene that night, requested a transfer to community outreach. He couldn't forget the look in the boy's eyes, the terror on his face. During his new training, he found himself sharing the story with other officers, using it as an example of why things needed to change. "We're supposed to protect people," he would say, his voice firm. "That includes protecting them from fear of us." The internal affairs investigation moved slowly, methodically. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed protocols, examined response times, and dispatch records. The question, "Why did this happen?" evolved into, "How do we prevent this from happening again?" The answers weren't simple, but they were necessary. At school, the boy's grades started slipping. Math, once his favorite subject, became a struggle. Numbers blurred together as his mind wandered back to that evening. His teacher noticed, staying after class one day to talk. Sometimes, she told him, it's okay to not be okay. She helped him create a study schedule, breaking big problems into smaller, manageable pieces, just like they were trying to do with the bigger problems in their community. The police department began new training programs. Officers sat through workshops about bias and community relations. They watched the videos from that evening, not as a scandal to be managed, but as a lesson to be learned. Some officers got defensive, others grew quiet and thoughtful. But they all had to confront the reality of how their actions could impact a child's life. The boy's mother started getting more involved in community advocacy. She joined committees, spoke at meetings, helped draft new policies. Her teacher's perspective brought something valuable to these discussions. She understood how trauma affected young minds, how fear could shape a child's future. Her voice became stronger, more confident, as she fought for changes that would protect not just her son, but all children. Local mental health professionals offered free counseling sessions for kids affected by similar experiences. The boy attended a group session where other young people shared their stories. Listening to them, he realized he wasn't alone. They talked about their fears, their anger, their hopes for change. Sometimes they just sat together in understanding silence. As weeks passed, small changes started adding up. The police department revised their protocols for responding to calls about young people. New community oversight committees were formed. Officers began regular visits to schools, not for security, but for conversation and connection. The wall between police and community began to show small cracks, letting in light where there had only been shadow before. The boy's mother stood at the podium, her hands steady on its wooden edges. The city council chamber was packed, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Through the large windows, she could see more community members gathered outside, holding signs and watching on a hastily set-up screen. Her son sat in the front row, wearing his best clothes, his back straight and eyes focused on her. "My son was taking out the trash," she began, her teacher's voice carrying clearly through the room. "It's something he'd done 100 times before. But that night changed everything, not just for us, but for this entire community." She paused, looking at the faces before her. Some she recognized from PTA meetings, others from the protests, and now here they all were, united in purpose. The proposed changes to police training and community engagement lay in neat stacks on the council members' desks. Weeks of community meetings, discussions with law enforcement, and consultation with civil rights experts had gone into these documents. But the mother knew that paper couldn't capture the real story, the human cost that had brought them here. "I'm not just speaking as a mother today," she continued. "I'm speaking as a teacher who has watched countless children grow up in our community. I'm speaking for every parent who has had to have difficult conversations with their children about safety and prejudice. I'm speaking for change." Her son watched from his seat, feeling a mix of pride and nervousness. Just that morning, he'd helped her practice this speech in their kitchen, timing her words and suggesting places to pause. Now he saw how the audience leaned forward, hanging on every word. His mom wasn't just telling their story, she was helping write a new one. The basketball kids were there too, sitting together in their team jerseys. They'd become regular fixtures at community meetings, speaking up about their experiences and ideas for change. Their coach had helped them start a youth advisory council, creating a space where young voices could be heard. The boy had joined them, finding strength in numbers and understanding in shared experiences. "We need mandatory bias training," the mother explained, pointing to specific sections in the proposal. "We need clear guidelines for police interactions with minors. We need community oversight and accountability." Her words weren't angry or accusatory. They were firm, practical, focused on solutions rather than blame. Outside the chamber, reporters scribbled notes and camera crews adjusted their equipment. This story had started with viral videos of one incident, but it had grown into something bigger. The local news station had been running a series on community policing, featuring interviews with residents, officers, and experts. They'd even interviewed the boy's math teacher about how the incident had affected students' sense of safety and belonging. In the weeks leading up to this meeting, the mother had worked tirelessly with community leaders and civil rights attorneys. They'd studied similar cases from other cities, learning from both successes and failures. The goal wasn't just to prevent another incident like her son's, it was to build a better relationship between the police and the community they served. The boy had found his own way to make a difference. After much thought and encouragement from his school counselor, he'd started speaking at student assemblies. At first, he'd been nervous, his voice barely above a whisper. But as he shared his story, he saw how it affected others. Younger kids asked questions, older ones shared similar experiences, and teachers listened with tears in their eyes. "Our children deserve to feel safe in their own neighborhoods," his mother continued. "They deserve to do simple things like taking out the trash without fear. But more than that, they deserve to see us, the adults in their lives, working together to make things better." The police chief sat in the audience, nodding as she spoke. He'd been meeting regularly with community leaders, working to rebuild trust. Some of his officers had resisted the changes at first, but seeing the boy speak at the police academy had changed minds. It's one thing to read about an incident in a report. It's another to look in the eyes of a child and hear how fear had replaced trust. As the mother wrapped up her speech, she looked directly at her son. "Change isn't easy," she said. "It takes time, effort, and courage. But when I look at our young people, at their strength, their resilience, their hope for a better future, I know it's worth it." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, but she stood tall, her shoulders straight. The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was thunderous, filled with emotion and purpose. People stood, some wiping tears, others nodding firmly. The boy clapped until his hands hurt, watching his mother step down from the podium. She had always been his hero, but now she was something more. She was a voice for change, a builder of bridges, a fighter for justice. 6 months had passed since that evening by the trash bins. The maple trees that had witnessed everything were now heavy with spring leaves, their shadows dancing on the sidewalk where everything had changed. The boy stood in his front yard, basketball in hand, watching as Officer Rodriguez stepped out of his patrol car for their weekly community walk. These walks had become a regular thing in the neighborhood. Every Wednesday afternoon, police officers would pair up with local kids and families, walking the streets together, talking about everything from basketball scores to community concerns. Today was the boy's turn to lead the walk, and he had a lot to show. "How's the youth council going?" Officer Rodriguez asked as they started down the street. The boy brightened, explaining their latest project, a series of workshops where young people could share their experiences with local law enforcement trainees. His own story had become part of the official training program, though he still found that strange sometimes. They passed Mrs. Chen's house, where she was tending to her spring flowers. She waved cheerfully, a far cry from the angry woman who had confronted officers with gardening gloves 6 months ago. Now she hosted monthly community dinners in her backyard, where residents and police officers could talk openly about their concerns and hopes for the neighborhood. The new police chief had made real changes. Every officer now wore a body camera that couldn't be turned off during interactions. The dispatch system had been updated to include more questions about suspected suspicious activity, requiring callers to provide specific reasons for their concerns. But more importantly, officers spent more time walking the streets, getting to know the people they served. At the community center, a group of kids played basketball under the watchful eye of their coach. The boy pointed out the new mural on the wall, a colorful piece showing diverse hands joined together, created by local artists and students. Below it hung a framed copy of the new community policing guidelines, written in simple language that everyone could understand. "Remember when this all started?" the boy asked, stopping by the corner store. The owner came out to greet them, carrying cold sodas, a Wednesday tradition now. Officer Rodriguez nodded, his face thoughtful. He hadn't been one of the officers there that night, but he'd seen the videos, had them burned into his memory during training. The boy's mother had become a regular speaker at police academy graduations. Her words about that night had become part of the curriculum, teaching new officers about the impact their actions could have on a child, a family, a community. The boy had watched her speak once, amazed at how she could turn their pain into purpose. They passed the local middle school, where the basketball kids still played every evening. But now there was a police car parked nearby, not for surveillance, but because Officer Thompson liked to shoot hoops with them after her shift. The kids had even given her a nickname, Coach T, and she helped them with their homework sometimes. The boys' grades had improved again. The counseling sessions had helped, but so had the change in the air. He didn't jump at the sound of police sirens anymore, though his heart still beat a little faster when he saw flashing lights. His mother said healing takes time, and that was okay. As they walked, neighbors came out to chat. The Wednesday walks had become a neighborhood institution, a time when people could voice concerns or share good news. Today, an elderly resident wanted to thank Officer Rodriguez for helping her grandson get into a youth mentorship program. A new family that had just moved in was invited to the next community dinner. They reached the park where the youth council held their meetings. The old picnic tables had been replaced with new ones, painted in bright colors by local kids. Here, twice a month, young people met with police officers to discuss their ideas for building trust and understanding. The boy was proud of the safe space signs they'd designed together, now displayed in shop windows throughout the neighborhood. "Want to see something cool?" the boy asked, leading Officer Rodriguez to a special bench. There, engraved on a small plaque, were the words, "Change starts with understanding," the Youth Council's motto. Below it was the date of that fateful night, not as a reminder of fear, but as a marker of when things began to change. The sun was setting as they completed their walk, casting long shadows across the street. The boy could see his mom watching from the kitchen window, just like she had that night. But now she was smiling, waving at Officer Rodriguez as he helped carry the trash bins to the curb. A simple act that meant everything. "See you next Wednesday," Officer Rodriguez asked, heading back to his car. The boy nodded, bumping fists with him, their usual goodbye. As the patrol car pulled away, other neighbors were bringing out their trash too. Kids played on front lawns, parents chatted across driveways, and somewhere down the street, someone was playing music. The boy stood for a moment, taking it all in. The fear from that night hadn't completely disappeared, maybe it never would. But it had transformed into something else. Determination, hope, and the knowledge that one story, told truthfully and heard with an open heart, could change everything. He picked up his basketball, heading inside for dinner, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of small steps toward bigger changes.